Politics is changing every year, every decade, much more rapidly than with the passage of each generation. But one generation after another is born into this peculiar, unbroken tradition of terms, of categories that we impose onto the political world. And if you want to be a joiner rather than a leader, these are not merely terms that you use to express abstract ideas to your friends. They're quite literally the clubs you sign up to join. They're the political parties you can become a member of. They're the masks you have to wear. They're the means you have to use in order to cooperate with others to change the world. In this video, I'm going to advance the notion that there are three fundamentally flawed ways of understanding who is a liberal, who is a conservative, who is left, who is right, who is progressive, who is right-wing, and so on and so forth. Three different optics, three different modes of analysis, each of which brings with it, frankly, its own distorting bias to the discussion. The first way to understand left and right is tragically the way in which this subject is entertained in classrooms. In my experience, not just university classrooms, primary school classrooms, high schools, from a very early age, we're taught to think of the distinctions between these political parties in terms of their origins, in terms of their foundational literature. And by the way, I'm not only speaking about Europe in this video, I'm not only speaking about the United States and Canada, I'm going to include places like Cambodia, Indonesia, Pakistan. I'm talking about the whole 21st century world. I'm talking about communist China, capitalist Japan, the whole sphere as it rotates through space. I'm dead serious in saying globally, in all cultures, in all languages, this emphasis on the first generation to use the terms, the literature from which the categories, in an etymological sense, originate. This emphasis discourages the vast majority of people from ever having any interest or engagement in politics. It's difficult to exaggerate just how dissuasive this is. So what does it mean to be a conservative? We already have some people in the comment section philosophizing about that, and understandably so. Millions of people are told in Europe, in America, even in Japan, I'm not joking, even in a place as exotic, culturally linguistic as Japan, conservatism begins with Edmund Burke and his critique of the French Revolution. Now, whether you're 12 years old or 22 years old, what sense can you make of Edmund Burke's denunciation of the French Revolution? What does this mean as you're trying to fashion your own political ideology? And to some extent, you're engaged, as corny as it may sound, to some extent, you're engaged in a voyage of self-discovery. You're trying to figure out what any of these terms mean to you. You're trying to figure out in what sense, perhaps, is your father a conservative? In what sense was your grandfather a conservative? In what sense are you going to be a conservative? Or are you going to make the fateful decision to challenge and change and overturn the family political tradition, something that brings with it great danger, great risk, and perhaps also great reward? And now here you are standing in a library aisle having taken Edmund Burke off the shelf. Now, some of you in the audience will think, oh, yeah, but that's just a problem Europeans have. If you're born and raised in China, you think it's easier? You think it's easier to be born and raised in Beijing, China, and to deal with this kind of original literature, foundational literature in politics, whether you think of that as Mao Zedong, the revolutionary generation, right? In a country where you're not allowed to read the critics and opponents of Mao Zedong, you only get one side. Or if you're reading Confucius, if you're reading Lord Shang, good looks, you're a teenager in China contrasting like Confucius to Mao Zedong. This is your understanding of left versus right, with Mao on the left and Confucius on the right. But good luck. The referendums effect, the sense of alienation, the sense of distantiation, the sense of not even knowing if this is part of the real world, like this is so surreal and dreamlike. You're supposed to figure out what this original literature has to do with politics today. It really does dissuade millions of people from ever becoming politicized, ever becoming engaged in democracy or discourse about politics, wherever it is they live around the world. Now, I just put in a brief further example or parallelism here. Some Americans will be watching this thinking, well, maybe that's how people feel in England. Maybe that's how people feel in China, but not here in the United States of America, because, what we all understand that the difference between left and right originates in the debates between the rats and the anti-rats in the drafting of the Constitution and, the first amendments to the Constitution. I'm sorry, some of you can't see the forest for the trees. It's exactly the same problem all over again. And I can say here with some confidence, none of you have read the philosophy that the Constitution of the United States of America is built on. Just to be honest with you, I don't think there's even one person in this audience. Okay, and if there's one exception now, if Oliver has read this stuff, there's one member of my audience, it's because he was directly inspired to do so by my own book on the subject, by my book, No More Manifestos, So if there are some people in the audience who've done that reading, you doubt what I'm saying here. Have you read what John Adams says about democracy? I don't believe you have. And again, if you do try to read that, what does John Adams have to say about democracy, about the relationship between ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and the idea of democracy in the revolutionary period of the United States of America, Declaration of Independence, and then moving on to the debates on the Constitution? It's utterly irrelevant to politics as we know it today. All you are left with is this haunting, terrifying sense that the political leaders of the past were completely insane. And that is, to a shocking extent, true. I just want to say very briefly, I think there's a very sober, responsible perspective from which you can say Mao Zedong was insane. Like, at the very least, incredibly eccentric, incredibly stupid, right? And now many of you in the audience who haven't actually read Mao Zedong, who haven't read any primary source, you're sitting there, oh yeah, I feel comfortable saying that. You shouldn't. If you haven't done the reading, you shouldn't feel comfortable making that judgment. It's very easy for us to all sit here and say that Joseph Stalin was insane, that Adolf Hitler was insane. Well, guess what, guys? The so-called founding fathers of the United States of America, if you haven't done the reading, you don't know, and you're never going to know. Okay, it really is that bad. And I'm even going to say about old Edmund Burke. All right, there's this strange mythology that's developed around Edmund Burke. I think it is really fair to say, if you go through claim by claim, the argument he's advancing in his critique of the French Revolution, every single thing he's saying is false, like it's factually wrong, and it's immoral, like the motivations behind what he's saying. What Edmund Burke has to say about slavery, what Edmund Burke has to say about democracy and liberty and the rule of aristocrats and the royal family in England. Like, on the one hand, it's factually wrong, it's dishonest. Like what he's saying about the revolution in France, it's not well informed. It's not the result of research he'd done or some well-informed opinion he developed. And on the other hand, it's actually deeply immoral. So look, that's the first of the three categories I'm talking about here in terms of, on the most elemental level, understanding politics. And understanding politics, again, I know it sounds corny, journey of self-discovery. This is part of understanding who we are, how we think of ourselves every day, how we communicate, again, with our own family, with our own fathers and grandfathers, for me, with the other people who live in this apartment building. If I go to the gym and I flirt with someone, some attractive woman at the gym, pretty close to the very first thing you judge about that person, they judge about you, is how left-wing is this person? How right-wing is this person? Where are they on the political landscape? Which preformed political category do they fit into? And then you flirt with each other. You have your first few conversations from there. You go out to coffee from there. Obviously, university campus is one of these incredibly charged contexts where I know that from the moment I'm talking to a professor, they are sizing me up, they are evaluating me, and they're placing me into a category for how right wing I am, how left wing I am, and so on. So again, this is a mask we can choose to wear, right? But in a sense, it's a mask other people are placing onto our face. People have a prefabricated notion of who you are supposed to be politically, which may be based on very, very little information. I mean, based on a 30-second conversation at the gym, or when you put up your hand in class at university and make one comment, one objection, and that's it. So you live with these categories. You struggle against these categories. And my first analytical foray here is to say, well, guess what? Understanding those categories in terms of their original literature. I'm using the word literature quite intentionally here, right? Because this may include Mao Zedong, but it may also include Confucius. It may also include Lord Shang. Like, it may include literature in this sense. And I mean, if you actually like Edmund Burke, it's okay. Melissa's contributing to the discussion by coughing. Don't worry about it. It's no big deal. It's totally fine. I do not interpret this the coughing as criticism. The coughing indicates shock and disbelief. Can you believe you went after Edmund Burke? But like, if you appreciate Edmund Burke, you can only appreciate it as literature. Sorry, another example. I don't think I've had a single person ever say from the audience that they're really a fan of Napoleon Bonaparte. If you really appreciate Bonaparte, he left us quite a lot of writing. Like, you can read primary source Napoleon Bonaparte. Again, you can only possibly appreciate it as literature. It's very hard to construe it as like a political tract that has anything to do with the real world as we inhabit it today. But of course, this is a kind of literature that explains the origins of these concepts. Look, sorry, just to argue against myself for a moment, which is an important part of politics. Some of you may have seen my earlier video, why I'm forcing you to read Aristotle. Oh, one of the reasons to read Aristotle, one of the reasons to care about Aristotle's politics, is precisely to understand the origin of these terms, including terms like democracy. What did democracy ever mean, so on and so forth. So yes, I'm criticizing this way of thinking about politics, the way of teaching politics, but of course, to some extent, I engage in it myself. It's an analytical framework with its own advantages and disadvantages. So the second category that I want to describe and summarily dismiss is thinking about political identity in terms of objectives, in terms of the society in the future that you want to live in. Now, again, this is sometimes useful, but it has tremendous drawbacks. If you actually think about politics the way, if you understand your own political identity this way, very rapidly you will find that you are all alone in the world. You are a member of a political party with just one member, you. Now, again, sometimes this is useful. Once in a while, we can ask, for example, if you contrast Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden, so the left wing of the Democrat Party, to what I think should frankly be called the conservative wing of the Democrat Party. I think not right wing, but conservative, I think is a good word to describe Joe Biden. He's kind of moderate conservative, and so are his followers. Yes, indeed. One of the ways to say, well, look, what really is the difference between these two political tendencies is to talk about what kind of society they're trying to create in the future. What really would be different if they had, unimpeded political power to bring about the reforms, to bring about the legislation that they want to achieve. Now, all right, let's expand the field a bit here. Let's say the contrast between Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and I always forget his name, Ben Shapiro. None of these people have a fundamental problem with the university system in the United States. None of them. And I've read Bernie Sanders' book. I've made some very unpopular YouTube videos reviewing and criticizing. Okay, none of them. So if you think about the society these three men want to inhabit in the future, right? This is something enormous and fundamental that they all have in common. They all want to live in a society that looks very much like the same society we have today, so far as the education system goes, as far as the university system goes. Okay? I don't. Like, my position as an intellectual dissident, as a political dissident, is that the university system is so bad in the United States of America that it would be a step in the right direction to burn down every single university campus in the country from coast to coast. I am not joking. Read my book. I mean, if you don't believe me, like, my radicalism on that, which is neither left wing nor right wing, is sincere. Sometimes you can have an institution that is so bad, that is so awful, that it can be improved through demolition. Okay. Now, what we do after that is an open question. Okay. So, talking about vision of the future, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Ben Shapiro. What's the role of the casino in our society in the future? None of these guys have a problem with casinos. Like, we can talk about how these are three fundamentally different men in terms of their political ideology. All of them have been to Las Vegas, Nevada at some point. I mean, at some point they've had to go to a conference there. Or I'm sorry, we can Google it. When was the last time Ben Shapiro was in Las Vegas? I am sure, but obviously in the United States today, look at a map of where casinos are. It's not just Las Vegas, coast to coast. Got casinos everywhere. There's a casino in Detroit, and there's a casino in Windsor, and there's the casino culture at one time was very marginalized in the United States of America. It's completely taken over the United States of America. Okay, and these are three supposedly very different guys politically. None of them have a problem with it. None of them want to do anything to change it. So, guys, I can go on with a lot of other examples here. Okay, the status and situation of indigenous people in the United States of America. So, who am I talking about? Mohawk, Navajo, Ojibwe, the real indigenous. I've read Bernie Sanders' book. It's in there. He has a couple sentences, just a few. Oh, and another thing. Oh, and let me just mention how much I care about indigenous people in the United States of America. None of them ever have lifted a finger. None of them ever will lift a finger. None of them, in terms of their vision of the future, like say 50 years from now, there's no fundamental difference. There's no fundamental change that they're aiming at or attempting to. They don't want to change anything. They don't have a problem with the status quo as it exists today. And, last but not least, right, religion. A lot of you may assume Bernie Sanders wants to burn the church down. That he wants, no, look through his whole career, including like the book he wrote when he was running for president. No, none of these guys have a problem with the power religion has in the United States, which includes religions owning and operating universities, religious groups owning and operating schools, churches, brainwashing children from the cradle to the grave. I think it is needless to say that my perspective is that the United States of America would be improved if you burnt down every church in the country from coast to coast. That, like, we're talking about an institution that is so bad that it could be improved through demolition. I'm actually an atheist. I'm not a hypocrite. I'm not an atheist pluralist who says, oh, well, you do you. Everybody's on their own spiritual journey. And anyway, this will come up later in the video. Okay, so, my point is this, ultimately, is the futility of analyzing these masks, analyzing these categories, analyzing these political identities in terms of the future, your outcomes you're trying to create. What is the utopia or dystopia you're trying to create? What is it you want to change about society? Again, we could say if you were allowed to legislate with no opposition, let's say, like, just you're elected and you have 75% of the seats in parliament or 75% of the seats in Congress or whatever you want to imagine. You have the tyranny of the majority on your side. What would be the change you bring about in society? Now, guys, these may seem like shallow things that these contrasting political demagogues have in common. They're not. All right? They're not. All of these guys have stepped over the bodies of indigenous people begging on the streets their whole life. All of these guys have driven their car past a shanty by the side of the highway selling collectible Native American art and raising, yeah. They've had the kind of momentary reminder that the country is built on this genocide at some point. They've gone to these different, utterly phony and insincere, monuments and ceremonies to multiculturalism. And at some point it's crossed their mind, oh, gee, look at that. There's a big banner or a big statue that has, Chinese and Hindi and quote unquote, all the languages of the world. Oh, let's celebrate diversity with all these. Oh, gee, but, for some reason, Cree isn't there. Ojibwe isn't there. Mohawk isn't there. Gee, actually, there isn't a single language indigenous to the United States of America on this poster or on this monument. Gee, multiculturalism actually means genocide. Like, I just say, even if you take no interest in it, at some point, Ben Shapiro has had to look in the mirror, like however fleetingly, and think about this. Joe Biden has had to deal with this reality. They've all had to think about the reality of the fact that, in the United States of America, tuition, families are supposed to save over $100,000 to put their kid through college. They've all had to face up to the reality of the university system from 10 different levels. They've all had to face up the reality of gambling and drug addiction. And we can go on to all these other things. And they don't give a fuck, all right? Their idea of the future is no different. No, sorry, Melissa, it is actually an excellent example because of the assumptions that are built into it. There is no diversity today, left versus right, on the question of antidepressants, of prescription mind-altering medications. So again, for some of you, you might think, oh, well, this is a tremendously shallow issue. No, it's not. So, what kind of world do you want to live in 50 years from now? Well, guess what? The answer from Joe Biden and the answer from Ben Shapiro is exactly the same. Now, but this is my critique of this analytical approach. It is sometimes useful. Like, it is sometimes useful to say, okay, how different is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from Joe Biden? How different is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from Bernie Sanders? Like, we can look at the future utopia or dystopia they're aiming at, how they want to accomplish it, what legislation they'd ideally like to do. We can learn something. We can make some distinctions, but the distinctions that are absent, like the questions that go unasked and unanswered, this is one enormous problem with this approach to understanding politics, understanding the political categories that, as I say, ultimately shape even our own personal identity and our interactions with others, the most shallow and fleeting, like flirting with someone at the gym, and the most profound relationship with our parents, with our children, with our lovers, with our husbands, wives, etc. And pragmatically, the problem is this results in each of us recognizing ourselves as a political party of one. Like, you will find you are so alienated from everyone else on the political spectrum wherever you live. As soon as you start thinking of these kinds of objectives, you will realize you have practically nothing in common with Bernie Sanders and practically nothing in common with Ben Shapiro, that what you want doesn't put you in a club, doesn't put you in a category, doesn't make you a member of a party. It results in your utter powerlessness and your utter political paralysis, I might say. So the third approach, which is what I want to emphasize, what I want to extol the advantages of in this video, to be honest, is to instead think about political identity in terms of moral characteristics, in terms of intellectual characteristics, in a very old-fashioned sense, in terms of psychological typology. And you'll see what I mean very quickly. To see the society you're living in, like whether it's the province you live in, the county you live in, the city you live in, or, larger scale, see huge parts of the world, all of Pakistan, 220 million people, all of Japan, all of a given hemisphere or continent on a huge scale, to see people sorting themselves by psychological type into different political camps. Again, the basis of moral characteristics, intellectual characteristics, and of course, within your life, that can change. It's incredibly difficult to find a stockbroker who is left-wing. It's incredibly difficult to find someone with real competence as an economist or as a financial advisor who is left-wing. 99% of people who develop that kind of competence, who go into that kind of career path, and you become real experts with expertise, I respect and you should respect. People who really know what they're talking about, are really good at that. 99% of them are either conservative or further to the right of conservative. They're conservative or right wing. This is something, by the way, many left-wing people encounter once they start making enough money that they need to find a stockbroker, or they need to find an accountant and a financial analyst. My parents were left-wing, to say the least. My parents were communist extremists. They were not even moderate amongst communists. They were on the far, far left. And naturally, when I was a boy, they were poor. Before I was born, they were even poorer. There were people who lived in poverty and desperation. These things go together. Communism and poverty. It's unsurprising. Well, as my life went on, they started getting more and more money. They started becoming more financially successful as entrepreneurs, running their own business. Irony of ironies. And also my father's financial obligations to his other children started to decrease. My father had 9 children. So if you have 9 kids, even if you have a reasonably well-paying job, you're going to be poor. But his kids started getting older and finishing college, finishing university, and so on. So his own financial situation started to improve. Of course they wanted to work with a left-wing accountant. Of course they wanted to work with a left-wing financial advisor, stockbroker, economist, these kinds of people. Of course, they had the strongest bias imaginable. They wanted to hire people who sympathized with them politically. They wanted to work with people who sympathized with them politically. And it was impossible to do. Of course, what they had to discover in their lives. I just say all around the world, people discover this. This is not just the United States of America. This is not just Canada. This is not just England. It's not just France. This sorting of people by psychological type, by moral characteristics, by their intellectual characteristics, in Japan, in Hong Kong, right? We can pick a whole long list of places. In South Africa. If you want someone who really understands the stock market, who really understands microeconomics and macroeconomics, for whatever purpose, whatever job, right now in Pakistan, right now in Denmark, what kind of person is that? Who do you meet with that kind of competence? And indeed, with a passion for that field. Now, so I'm setting up 2 criteria here. One is economic. Sorry, I should say criteria. This is kind of like a litmus test for just what I'm saying about this approach to understanding political categories. All right. There's a perfectly symmetrical example of right-wing people going into filmmaking, right-wing people going into cinema. Now they may want to make a documentary film. They may want to make a fictional film, like a narrative, like an action movie or a science fiction movie that advances right-wing and conservative ideas because they feel, understandably, that Hollywood is dominated by the left. Now, it's perfectly symmetrical to my parents' experience. Like they're left-wing people. They start becoming wealthier, and they find the only people they can hire and work with to manage their money, to work with them as economists, are conservative. Okay. Right-wing and conservative people go to Hollywood. They want to work with a cinematographer. They want to work with all kinds of creative artists in Hollywood. They want to start making movies. Who do they have to work with? And obviously, these right-wing people, they may be multimillionaires when they go to Hollywood. They may say, hey, we've put together several $1 million to make a movie. And they only want to have colleagues who are also conservative or who are also right-wing, as the case may be. And they get there, they get to Hollywood, they start doing the auditions, they start doing the hiring process. And there is nobody. It's like 99% of people who work in cinema are left-wing or at least left of center. They're at least liberal, whatever the word liberal means anymore, if not far left-wing. Now, why is that? Right now, in the United States of America, if you think of a barrier to entry before you can start earning a living, which one is more expensive? Starting a career as an economist or starting a career in cinema. I guarantee you, I know for a fact, because I've researched the hell out of this, given my own interests, looking at university education for decades now, I guarantee you it's easier for a poor person to get a degree in economics, to get a degree in finance, to get a degree in stock market analysis, being a stockbroker, being a financial analyst. That whole field is much easier and much cheaper to get ahead in than cinema. If you want to start your career in Hollywood, Google it right now. How much does it cost to get a university degree in cinematography in California, any Greater Los Angeles, any of those universities? You have to have parents who are willing to pay a huge amount of money for you to get university education that will qualify you for, that will prepare you for a career in cinema in Hollywood. And indeed, it's so expensive. Like let's say it's $500,000 that you need to go into cinema through the traditional academic route of actually receiving hands-on training and learning to do cinematography, learning to be a filmmaker. It is so expensive that if your parents have the money, of course, you're in the position of saying, well, look, why don't you just give me the $500,000 now and I'll buy a camera and hire some people and try to do what Kevin Smith did, try to just be an independent filmmaker with no formal education. Sorry, Kevin Smith's case, very little formal education. I don't want to get into his whole education background. You know, why not just go straight out of high school, take $500,000 and make a film? And you will fail. I mean, it is almost guaranteed. There's almost a 100% failure rate. You can't get ahead as a quote unquote self-made man in Hollywood. So my point is this sorting of people, the people sort themselves, put themselves into these categories and choose their careers, choose what direction they're going to go in and so on. It very, very powerfully reflects and reveals what the difference between conservative and liberal is, what the difference between progressive and whatever the opposite of progressive is, what the difference is between left and right. And this works in every culture, in every language, all around the world. So you can, I mean, if a child asks you, what is the difference between left and right? Let's say an 11-year-old child. So a child that's capable of reasoning and thinking complex thoughts and reading and so on. Not talking about a toddler here. If an 11-year-old child asks you, what is the difference between left and right? I think it's actually really counterproductive to tell them, Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, he invented conservatism. This was this new idea this guy Edmund Burke had. And the left-wing people, instead, they were the ones who made excuses for the French Revolution. They were people like Napoleon. Napoleon was a Jacobin. So yeah, there you go, kid. Go to Wikipedia and check out Edmund Burke. Get the it's a terrible answer. And I'd say it really does dissuade people from being seriously engaged in politics. Now, although it is better, although it is more useful, as I've said, it's actually very misleading and limiting to instead talk about the future utopia these people are trying to, which again, you can probably imagine yourself saying that to an 11-year-old kid. Say, well, in the future, this is the kind of society that Joe Biden wants to create. And this is the kind of society Ben Shapiro wants to create. Well, guess what, guys? It's the same society. I mean, this is the fucking joke. Yeah. And if I'm sorry, if you think America is bad this way, where there's no real difference between the left and right in mainstream politics, have you been to France? Have you been to Denmark? Like most of Europe, the difference, and in Europe, the parties are actually called socialist. Unlike in Germany and France, you actually have a party that openly calls itself the Socialist Party. But what they represent is in no way differentiable from what even the far right wing parties are the future that they are advocating for. It's just a joke. It's just laughable. And that is what, you have this alienation between the kind of professional class of technocrats who dominate quasi-democratic politics in Europe and alienated dissident intellectuals who occasionally do things like starting the Yellow Vest movement and so on, trying to challenge this political system. Right? So, thinking about this in terms of the future, in terms of the objectives people are, but it's actually very meaningful to talk about what kind of person joins the Conservative Party, what kind of person joins the Liberal Party, what kind of person comes on YouTube like Misha, who you see here in the title of this video, what kind of person wraps themselves in the flag of this political ideology and publicly identifies with it and advocates for it? Like, who takes the mask and puts it over their own face and really positively identifies with this? There's something quite profoundly telling about the fact that people who care about the stock market are conservative. This really lays bare what conservatism is, and it's totally paradoxical. Like, it's not easy to summarize what conservatism means or what draws people to working on the stock market. And likewise, if you think of cinema, all right, cinema is not one skill set, all right? I heard an interview recently with a guy who just edits the trailers for Hollywood movies. So, that Hollywood gives him normally the unfinished movie. They give him, so he's got like 3 hours of footage, before the movie's been through its final cut. And he goes through and takes little snippets of that and puts it together into a 1-minute sizzle reel. And then he adds that voiceover. This summer, coming to a theater near you, dinosaurs, as you've never seen them before. One man will stand up. Like, this is cinema. It's not one skill set. It's not one, you think about all the different creative people doing all kinds, and all the financial people and all the people who work in casting and all the people who do hair and makeup and lighting and staging the action sequences and so on. This is not one skill set. This is an incredibly variegated, incredibly heterogeneous group of people who are brought together by cinema, by filmmaking. And all of them are left wing. Like, 99% of these people are left of center liberal, if not far left wing. Right? Just go to Hollywood. Just try to put together a project that's all conservatives. Try to get the hair and makeup people. Try to get the editors and the guys who do the lighting and the stunt work and everything. Like, this is beyond 99%. Now, are there exceptions? Yes. Ronald Reagan understood nothing about economics. Nothing. What Ronald Reagan had to say about economics, what he wrote about economics, and the most telling source is what he wrote before he became president of the United States, when he was really doing the writing himself, when he didn't have a team of people, managing his public message. You can look at the earlier writings of Ronald Reagan. This guy understood nothing about economics. He came out of a Hollywood filmmaking background. He worked in cinema. That's who he was. He's a great example of someone who had no competence in either field. I guess I can't insult him as an actor. I mean, whatever. Can't insult him as a filmmaker, but he utterly lacked exactly the competence people presumed he had, because he was conservative, or even we could say right wing. I think it's fair to say he was further right than just conservative. Okay, so look, the first kind of litmus test I'm presenting you with here, which already, it depends how old you are, but I think even if you're 16 years old, you can relate to this. Let's think about a 16-year-old kid who's in high school, and they see a certain type of student joining the Young Conservative Club. There's a certain type of 16-year-old kid who is already listening to Ben Shapiro and is joining that club. And it can change. Like, who this person is morally, who this person is intellectually. Their character can change. 10 years from now, they might not be like that. But already in high school, you see it and you feel it. I just mentioned one of the few kids I knew like that when I was in high school was black. I knew a black guy. And I just mentioned, like, he wasn't light-skinned black. He really looked black. Like, this is politically significant. And he was he was exactly that stereotype, and he wore a suit to school every day and stuff, like even the style of clothing. And he was really passionate about the conservative government in Ontario at that time. It's just mind blowing. And, I'm sorry, but none of the other black kids in the high school would even sit next to him. Like he had so alienated. Of course, he alienated himself from the majority of white people also, but like he had really put himself in this very difficult position. I mean, who's he going to date? Who's going to go to the prom with him? Like Jesus Christ, like what a horrible life this kid has cut out for himself. I remember that kid in high school. And then as a contrast, I knew a black girl. This was in my last year of high school. I was already very cynical about Marxism and communism. I was already, my parents had raised me to be a communist and a Marxist, but I had already started to see my way out of that, And I remember a black girl who had chosen at that time, and her manner of speaking, she would actually stutter and become nervous and talking about it. But she was actively identifying as a Marxist and a communist in her last year of high school. Now, again, my point is this: if you are 46, you should have a whole lifetime of experience, including looking at YouTubers and people like Misha and so on. You can see there's a different type of character. There's a different type of character who's drawn to, one political ideology or another. And guys, you think Japan is different? This is the scary thing about human nature. It's exactly the fucking same. Japanese politics and American politics are exactly the fucking same. It's like depressing and mind-blowing how similar a completely different linguistic tradition like Japan, completely different historical tradition, completely different religious tradition, and you see exactly the same things coming out again. So look, I only want to use kind of two litmus tests, for lack of a better term, just these examples that right away put a human face on it, make you see that the strength of an approach is based on moral character, intellectual character, and in an old-fashioned sense, psychological typology. Okay. Anywhere you go in the world, whether we are talking about America, Europe, Japan, or Sri Lanka, anywhere you go in the world, who is it that supports and draws support from mainstream religion, a religion with millions of adherents and millions of followers? Who chooses to attach themselves politically to the religious establishment? This pattern runs so deep in human nature. Like as a litmus test, this is one of the most telling, that when you're contrasting societies that have a totally different religious tradition, a religious tradition as different as Buddhism in Sri Lanka is from Buddhism in Japan, as different as Islam is from Catholicism. Nevertheless, globally, everywhere you go in the world, it is the conservatives and it is the right wing who are attached to, who support and are supported by religion as it actually exists in the world, religion with millions of followers. Not a utopian idea of what religion might be in the science fiction future, not some tiny splinter group or new cult. Once in a while, the left wing, latches onto that because they create some new religion to give a voice to their left wing ideal. That it's never mattered much in the history of the world, but the left wing sometimes fucks around with that. Utopian socialism becomes a religion, or whatever you want to say. This kind of thing happens on a small scale. Okay, now look, I recently considered and began the paperwork to apply for citizenship in Israel. As modern Israel in 2022. Just in the last couple of days, over 100 missiles were launched at Israel from the Gaza Strip. I know exactly how fucked up it is, right? With no illusions, no kind of mythos in my mind. Right? I considered moving to Israel. If you make a checklist of what today in Israeli politics, what is the left-wing position and what is the right-wing position in politics within Israel. So I just want to note, all of Israel is basically socialist. Okay, you could say this with many countries in Europe too. Even Germany, to give a really quick example. In Germany, the right wing does not want to privatize healthcare. The right wing, the far right in Germany, they still presume that poor people should have free medical care provided by the government. So like all of politics in Germany is further to the left than it is in Texas in the United States. I mean, so just start with that caveat. The whole, like the center of the political compass is already pretty far to the left in Israel. It's a country built on socialist origins or socialist history. What do you want to say? Utopian socialist even. Okay. If you make a checklist of what are the current debates within Israeli politics. By the way, all of Israel, including the right wing, is pro-abortion. It's hilariously. So again, in some ways, this is very different from the distinction of left and right. So you make a list of the left versus right issues in Israel today. I'm on the right wing on every single one of them, except one. Okay. So this is a country where I would be a conservative, and on some issues, I'd even be right wing, except for just one issue that puts me at the left wing extreme and would probably force me to live my whole life in a left wing intellectual ghetto. That one issue is religion. The fact that I am openly an atheist, the fact that I am vocally an atheist, the fact that I am not willing to kid myself about circumcision and the harm it does to newborn babies, whether they be Jewish or Muslim, frankly, right? The fact that I am not willing to buy into a lie that like Moses, that Moses was divinely guided by God when he decided to slaughter 3,000 of his own people at the sword because they didn't agree with him, establishing a cycle of religious persecution and violence that continues to this day. And all of the Judeo-Christian religions. I'm not willing to pretend Moses was a morally good person when he went from door to door, from tent to tent, and slaughtered 3,000 of his own people for not being pious enough by his standards, not being pious enough to satisfy the bloodthirsty demon in the sky he worshipped. All right, guys, just my position on this one issue locks me into the left-wing ghetto forever. Nobody, no conservative is ever going to have lunch with me. There's no way I can ever participate in a conservative or right-wing party because of this one issue. What if I move to Louisiana? What if I move to Georgia in the United States of America? Okay, just this one issue. It doesn't matter. You can go through a checklist. What are the issues on which I'm conservative or right wing? I'm a very well-informed critic of the left. You know, I know everything that's wrong with what Bernie Sanders' position is. I also, by the way, like I within Israeli politics, I listen to the news from Haaretz. You know, I'm very aware of what's going on the left, right? Now, look, I want to say this to you seriously, guys. Anyone who examines a foreign culture, anyone who examines a foreign country in which they do not believe in that foreign culture's religion, they do not believe in that foreign country's dominant religion, will therefore be left-wing in relation to that country and its politics. Not even liberal, not left of center, left-wing. Right? So you guys may not remember this. Years ago, I challenged Melissa to start doing a research project on Central Asia. Because now, how many of these countries can I name? Remember? Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. You know, that part of the world. Now, there are different reasons why I challenged her to do that in terms of her own education and development. Melissa, if we were going to move permanently to Uzbekistan and that, do you imagine you'd be part of the local conservative party? No. Do you imagine you'd be right wing? Do you imagine, you know, like once you settle in, you think, man, these libtards, I just gotta own the libs, you know, like these fucking libtards, they're so woke now that I'm here in Uzbekistan. it just pisses me off the way they go on and on. They're so precious with their feelings. There is absolutely no way you could ever have the luxury of being conservative or right-wing in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, just because of the aspect of religion. 220 million people live in Pakistan. Okay, guys, let's just imagine you're offered a contract. There's some high-paying job where you're going to go live in Pakistan for 20 years. You're going to really settle down. You're going to really learn the language and really learn the culture. You can never be a conservative in Pakistan. You can never be right-wing just because you don't believe in Islam. That one criterion. So, guys, this runs really deep, and it's really fucked up. And it means that in every country, everywhere in the world, there is no political spectrum, right? Sorry, let me just say further. This is easy for you to visualize when it's a foreign religion you're terrified of, like Islam, right? That's easy. Okay, yeah, I guess you're right. I guess if I move to Saudi Arabia, I have no choice but to be left-wing. Some of you, I have conservative fans. But guess what? If you move to Saudi Arabia, you're left-wing. If you move to Pakistan, you're left-wing. Any country where you don't sympathize with religion. But I want to say this to you really sincerely, okay? Of all the major mainstream religions in the world, so religions that have millions of adherents, we're leaving out tiny cult groups, okay? What's the best? What's the one you could sympathize with the most? What's the one where you can imagine it playing a positive role in the 21st century, in the 22nd century, instead of a negative one? What's the religion you think you could make your peace with? You could say, okay, look, they're wrong about some things, but let's work with what we've got. We've got lemons, make lemonade. Right. There is no doubt in my mind, although I'm a harsh critic of it, there's no doubt in my mind it's Buddhism. Right? Buddhism is so much morally superior to the other religions. It is so intellectually superior to the other religions, right? A lot of people don't even want to say it's a religion. They don't want it to be in the same category as Islam. Like, hey, I got a great idea for a religion, guys. Let's cut our dicks off and make excuses for slavery. All right, like Buddhism as a philosophical tradition, as a religion, has a lot going for it positively. All right, you might make the decision in your life. In my own autobiography, you can guess there are elements of me that drew me in this way. Right? You might say today you're going to pack up and move to Sri Lanka and start a new life. And part of the appeal, so right now Sri Lanka is going through an economic crisis. Buy the dip, invest now. You're going to go to Sri Lanka and you can say, look, you know what? I've got my problems with Buddhism. I don't believe in demons. I don't believe in yetis. I don't believe in going to hell after you die. But you know what? I'm going to embrace this. I'm going to make the most of the experience. I'm going to learn to speak Sinhalese. And part of my learning, I'm going to go to the local Buddhist temple, and I'm really going to try to commit. Okay. I guarantee you, if you go and deal with the reality of the religion in Sri Lanka, not the theory on a chalkboard, not the academic appraisal, not the philosophy as exists in a kind of rarefied, textbook setting. If you live with the reality of the religion, you will become left-wing. Like, it's as inevitable as a fucking can of tomato soup rolling down a staircase. One way or the other, you're going to see what these people believe in. You're going to despise it, and you're going to despise them. And then you're going to find yourself again in the left-wing ghetto, like even with the best of all possible religions, right? Like religion as a force in the world and the effect it has in sorting people into this political typology, right? Now look, guys, I hate to say this. Sri Lanka has repeatedly suffered through communist revolutions. They failed. Like some of them had some success for a while, and then, they ruled a certain amount of territory within Sri Lanka for a little while, and then the army drove them out and this kind of thing. Sri Lanka has a tremendously violent and storied history of both communism and socialism. That's horrifying. It's just awful. And what those people believe is horrifying and awful. And if you first move there, you may feel like, hey, one of the great things this country really has going for it is its Buddhist heritage. It's Buddhist, like this is so much better than being in a Muslim country or a Hindu country. You may feel really, hey, why are you left wingers trying to destroy the religion here when it's one of the only kind of positive, charming, aesthetically appealing things about the country? You know what? That could last for a while. You could go through that as a phase, the making excuses for Buddhism phase. All right. Religion is such a fundamental evil in life on earth, right? Like, unless you are an alcoholic, unless you're falling asleep drunk every night, whether it takes you 5 years or 10 years, it is just a matter of time. If you do not believe in the religion, if you do not drink the Kool-Aid in any foreign culture, doesn't matter how many things the conservatives are right about, doesn't matter how many things they're correct about, I should say, right? You will end up in the left-wing ghetto because of that factor of religion alone. Okay. Now, look, to some extent, you guys may be hearing this and thinking, well, isn't this just a kind of harmless game that people play? I've used the image of a masquerade, people putting on a mask. And indeed, even the example of a 16-year-old in high school who joins the conservative club. Isn't this sort of all in good fun to some extent? Isn't it kind of a low stakes game that people play? And you can change your hat at any time. Some people just now have gone through a few years of being a Donald Trump supporter, and then they get disillusioned, and maybe now for a few years they'll support Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or something. Well, come on, are the stakes really so high? What I find most disturbing when I look at people like Misha, I'm going to get her name wrong. Oh, can someone tell me? This new social media star, this new influencer who has, frankly, Misha Petrov. Okay, so Misha Petrov, she's probably going to go on to be the next right-wing darling in tweed. I have every reason to think she'll, I forget these people's name. She's going to go on to be the next Milo Yiannopoulos, something like this. She may go on to be tremendously influential just on the basis of having a pretty face and pandering to that right-wing interest. And I think some people could look at her YouTube channel and say, well, look, on the one hand, isn't this all just in good fun? She's playing kind of dress-up conservative demagogue. And some people might say, well, look, don't be so critical towards her. At least she's got some kind of ambition to make the world a better place, an ambition to educate herself politically, to talk about politics. Unlike other girls her age, and frankly, other girls with a similarly pretty face, look at what they're doing on YouTube. Look at what they're doing on Instagram. Look at what they're doing on TikTok. Look at what they're doing on OnlyFans. Somebody might challenge me and say, look, isn't this exactly what you want to encourage? Someone could ask me, wouldn't you be proud if your own daughter started doing political commentary on YouTube like this and really trying to, because ultimately you're going to learn something by engaging in these debates. People think of political education in terms of what you're reading, in terms of what you're learning. And what they fail to think about is the extent to which political education and the development of a political identity very centrally and powerfully and passionately involves what you are refusing to read, the voices you are refusing to hear, self-selected and willfully sustained ignorance. That's the power of political identity. That's why I feel it's very dangerous and very negative to see what Misha is doing on YouTube. Misha said on camera recently, a few days ago, that she feels bad about what America did to its indigenous people, to First Nations people too. She says she thinks it's terrible the way that they're treated. But she says every country, everywhere in the world, is built on somebody conquering someone else, and she panders to her right-wing audience or conservative audience. She does a completely paint-by-numbers argument saying that the real problem is white guilt. The real problem is Americans being made to feel bad about themselves. Like, the real problem is Americans just have low self-esteem. Like, politically, like, Americans just can't take any pride in themselves. Like, yeah, that's the problem, as opposed to genocide, as opposed to slavery, right? Now, I don't need to critique this particular view to any extent, but Misha, if you see this video, which is possible, Japan is not built on genocide. The indigenous people of Japan are the Japanese. The indigenous language of Japan is Japanese. I want you to put a dollar value on that. I want you to tell me what that's worth in dollars and cents. The indigenous people of Australia are a tiny, tiny minority of Australia. The indigenous languages of Australia are spoken and understood by an incredibly tiny minority of the people of Australia. Now, within America, it varies a little bit from state to state. I want you to visualize what percentage of the state of California is indigenous. What percentage of the state of California speaks an indigenous language? Okay. Now, how do you put a price on that? How do you assign a value to that? When tourists go to Japan, they see Japanese culture. They eat Japanese food. They go to Japanese museums that present them with at least 3,000 years of continuous Japanese history. They may hate it, all right? But that's worth something. There's something you're paying for. There's something you're paying to see. There's something you're paying to experience in Japan. And you can put a price on it, all right? Now, when Japanese people come together to vote, when they come together to do this thing we call democracy, parliamentary representative democracy. It's not direct democracy. It's not real democracy. All right. They do so with the advantages and the benefits of that at least 3,000 years of history and culture and language and food. In Japan, you can see something that's called Japanese architecture. What's that worth, Misha? Can you put a price tag on Japanese architecture, that there is such a thing, and you can go everyone knows what you mean. You can, if they ask you at the airport, why are you here? You can say, yeah, I'm an architecture student. I really want to get a tour. I want to see Japanese art. Everyone knows what you don't have to explain it. If you go to Australia today, if you buy an airplane ticket to Australia and you say at the airport you're interested in Australian architecture, what do you mean? What do you talk about? Well, do you mean like archaeology of what the indigenous people had here before Europeans got here? Well, what? There's going to be like confusion as to even the meaning of the term. If you say you're going to Australia for Australian cuisine, Australian food, the Australian language, Australian culture, if you go to a museum in Australia for Australia's history, all right, there's a real deficit there. There's something in that contrast. And I could now repeat myself for California, right? Everyone wants to kid themselves about this, but guess what? There is no Californian culture. There is no Californian architecture. There is no Californian cuisine. There is no Californian food. And California is probably the most culturally dense part of the United States of America. If you want to talk about, if you want to talk about Ontario, if you want to talk about New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, it gets real bleak, guys. I used to live in Saskatchewan. California probably has the most to offer in terms of culture. And that's why tourists go there. But the contrast to Japan, right? It's horrifying, right? And I want you with your little right-wing brain to rub those brain cells together and tell me what that's worth. Okay? And I think if you're being honest with yourself, you're going to say this is priceless. This is billions of dollars. This is millions. It's so hard to estimate what we've lost. And it's so hard to estimate what we can fucking do from here. Like, how are we even going to cope with this? Where do we go from here now, given how far advanced we are down that path? Where places like the United States and Canada and Australia have nothing but a third-rate imitation of European culture. All right. This is really a crisis. This is really a problem. And it's just laughable for you to say every country in the history of the world is based on one group of people conquering another, or one group of people committing genocide against another. Okay, Misha, if the only example in the world were Japan, if the only contrasting example were Japan, where the indigenous people are the majority of the people, where the indigenous language is the majority, if that were the only example, it would be enough to overturn your worldview, the excuses you're living with. And as I always warn, the excuses are harder to quit than the thing itself. Okay, this is my warning about how this character typology works. Then once we have these categories, once we have these political identities, where do we go from there? What do we do with it? So, Misha says, and I think she's being sincere, that she feels bad about what, the government of the United States of America did to its indigenous people. She says she feels bad, even in the midst of an attack on white guilt. That sounds a lot like white guilt. She says she feels bad about it. Do you feel bad enough about this to read one book? One. You're not going to read one book about the history of the genocide. You're not going to read one book about the indigenous people and Native Americans. Because if you do, if you sincerely read just one book, it will drag you over to the left. It will make you a left-wing person. I don't even think that's true of just this one issue. I'm being real with you, Misha. Your commitment to conservatism is paper thin. This is one of those things where, if you start pulling on a loose piece of yarn, the whole sweater starts to come apart. Okay? This one issue, facing up to and dealing with America's history of genocide, facing up to and dealing with what the reality of multiculturalism is for indigenous people, for these languages, right? Dealing with, why don't you go through president by president, what they had to say about it, right? Why don't you can start anywhere. You can start with, the writing of the American Constitution, start with the Northwest Ordinance, the first putting pen to paper and committing to commit this genocide. You can go through that history generation by generation, coming right down to Bill Clinton writing his national apology to the indigenous people of Hawaii. Real high point in history of American political hypocrisy. You are going to feel disgusted. You are going to feel revolted. You are going to feel like a left-wing dissident intellectual. And you're going to feel that this is so important that all the things the left are wrong about seem trivial by comparison. The left are wrong. The left are wrong about, among other things, I can just come back to the same example, economics. It's shocking how economically illiterate the left are. It's a really consistent leitmotif in the left. They don't understand microeconomics. They don't understand macroeconomics. They don't understand how taxation works, or they don't understand the monetary supply system. They really don't. And it's terrifying. Think if one of these left-wing people gets into government, they can bankrupt the whole country. We can have an economic crisis like Sri Lanka is going through right now. We really can. It's really scary. There are things the left is really wrong about. Okay. But what I'm talking about now is not just something the right is wrong about. It's something that's wrong with each and every mask we wear, with each and every category we may put ourselves into, we may sort ourselves into. What you're doing, Misha, I think what everyone does, normally starting at a very young age, is that you commit to one of these categories. You commit to one of these political identities. Does that lead you to do a little bit of reading, a little bit of learning? Yes. And that's a very positive thing. I think that's the side of that YouTube channel that we could all celebrate. So, well, it's good. Here's a young person who's getting interested and inspired about political history and trying to learn more and trying to present an informed opinion on YouTube. And that can lead positively to new questions and new answers. And obviously, it's more positive than her starting a review channel for designer high-heeled shoes, you know, the latest designer purses out of Italy. I mean, I know what other young women her age make YouTube channels about. So it's easy to praise that positive aspect. But what is terrifying about political identity, what ossifies this into, frankly, a cult-like and destructive set of beliefs, right, is that it entails also this commitment to the books you will never read, what you will remain ignorant of by choice, by act of will, what you will refuse to hear, what you will refuse to listen to. Because if you let yourself do that reading, if you let yourself do that thinking, if you let yourself see through those eyes, think through that perspective, it will destroy your personal sense of identity. It will erode your faith. Religious people live their whole lives without reading the Bible. Why? They can't. They can't read the Bible because just the act of reading it will destroy the faith they have in it. The vast majority of Americans, left, right, and center, cannot read John Adams. They can't. The political philosophy of John Adams, who John Adams really was, right? It will destroy their faith in the United States of America, in the Constitution, right? And I can add a whole long list of names here alongside John Adams. All right, he's not the only one. Whatever, you can read my book, you know, about 50% of my book, No More Manifestos, is a critique and discussion of the American Constitution, the American history, maybe 30 or 40%. A substantive amount of this very well-researched discussion of these things. All right. So this is the problem, is that people put on these masks. They take pride in this kind of identity, right? And it locks them into a form of ignorance, right? That frankly makes a meaningful life impossible. I'm going to be real with you. It makes the future of democracy impossible. All right? And this problem is very deeply rooted in our system of education, university, high school, primary school. People decide who they are first and foremost. They decide what kind of person they want to be. Along with the answer to that question comes a package of religious and political beliefs. They live their lives with believing being primary, knowing being secondary. On the basis of that political identity, on the basis of that religious commitment, right? They make a commitment to what they will not know, what they will remain ignorant of, and what they will consider it morally positive to remain blind to, with that blindness then lasting from the cradle to the grave.